Hi, I'm Suzanne, and this is Not Really Strangers, the podcast where we explore just how connected the refugee experience is to our everyday lives and to the social issues that matter most to us. Thanks for joining us for another conversation with a brand new guest, here to share the story of how they came to realize that their story and the refugee story were intertwined. By the end of this episode, you'll see that in this global community, the distance between us is often much shorter than we think. Let's dive in. Listeners, you're about to engage in and enjoy a conversation that I was honored to have with Jina Krause-Vilmar, CEO of Upwardly Global, although many of you will know from watching her on LinkedIn and elsewhere that she has made the decision to step down and move on. So incredible organization that she's led that will soon be under new leadership. And then we will get the pleasure of seeing where Jina lands next. But the conversation sort of kicks right off. We dive right in. A policy-rich conversation, which I love, having long been a DC policy wonk and really believing in the power of upstream change. And Upwardly Global is a master of it in the space of livelihoods and the sort of agency and sense of purpose that work brings to all of us, but almost particularly to those who've been displaced and are looking to kind of re-anchor and resettle in a new land. So here's the conversation. Enjoy. I first want to say that you and I first met when I had just come into my role at USA for UNHCR. Someone connected us or we reached out to each other, and you were very generous with me on an early call in your role as president and CEO of Upwardly Global. And I think really, quite frankly, turned me on to this idea of economic inclusion and livelihoods, which I've seen then like replicated and sort of at the core of some of UNHCR's most impactful work in places where labor pathways are available. So we can go there a little bit later in our conversation. But thank you, maybe 2 years later, for being so generous with me in those early days.
Happy to, and thrilled to be on this podcast.
Thank you. I'm going to start off with a personal question. Where do you live and where do you call home, if they're the same or if they're different?
Yeah, so I live in Brooklyn, New York, and I call Brooklyn, New York my home. Even though I was not born in Brooklyn, I was born in Jamaica, Queens. And even though I grew up in Houston, Texas, Brooklyn is my community.
I'm from San Antonio. Also did sort of a northeast journey down all my adolescence and schooling in San Antonio and then back up to the East Coast. So I too call Washington, D.C., where I am now, home for that same reason of like a shared community and values. And certainly the work that I've pursued has always been rooted in Washington. I also know from the work that you've done and the multiple bios and accolades and press interviews that you've done, I know that you come from an immigrant family. And I wonder if you can share with the audience a little bit about what it meant growing up in an immigrant family and notions that taught you about home and belonging that might be interesting for us to learn from.
Yeah, so my family originally comes from Punjab, India, and my parents had an arranged marriage. And my mom specifically wanted to marry my dad because he was working in the United States. They got divorced when I was 2 years old. I'm the youngest of four. And my mom had a choice at that stage to either go back to India or to stay in the US. And she decided to stay in the United States because she wanted us to have choices that she didn't have, choices around who we married, what we studied, what jobs we got, where we decided to live. And so even though she had a master's degree from a prestigious university, she ended up working 3 low-wage jobs to put food on the table for myself and my 3 sisters. And I think for me, what I learned from her is where you call home is a choice. And where you call home is based on the values of the community that you're living in and how community shows up for each other.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's partially why I call Brooklyn home.
Yeah. That home as a choice reminds me a bit of the kind of chosen family piece that we have as many of us live farther from our parents or places where we grew up. And we're surrounded by a community of friends who care for our kids and take care of us when we're sick and walk our dogs when we're out of town. All of that is this sort of notion of chosen family. And I like connecting that to the idea of chosen community. When you think about your mom, Do you, as you go through your adulthood and start a family or move apartments or get a new job, do you ever look back and wonder like how she did that when she was the age that you are now and kind of just have this sort of sense of awe about what the generation before us pulled off?
Oh my God. First of all, my mom had kids younger than I had kids. Um, and I had my first child and I completely fell apart because it was so hard. It was so hard breastfeeding. It was so hard juggling. It was so hard also keeping the job. And I can't imagine how my mom did it with the four of us, honestly, and how she did it by herself, frankly. It's not like she had an extended family that she could lean on and rely on. And I remember when I was maybe like 13 years old, I was in the car and I looked over to my mom who was driving and I said, Mom, you are so strong. And she looked at me and she's like, I'm not strong. I am just what I need to be in order to navigate and thrive in this moment. And I just found it so interesting because oftentimes we look at people and we say, wow, they're so resilient or they're so strong. But for them themselves, that's not how they're experiencing it because they're just being what they need to be. And I think a lot about that for our refugee community because oftentimes they have to navigate all of these changes in these difficult environments where they have fewer access to resources and opportunities. And we often say they're so resilient. They're so adaptable. And the reality is they are what they need to be.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a beautiful line. They are what they need to be. And I also appreciate that you were 13 and said that to your mom. I have a teenager and I think she does give me compliments, but I can't think of all that many instances where they're really taking a step back and kind of acknowledging all the things that my partner make possible in their lives. So kudos to Gina at age 13. You started talking a little bit about the refugee experience. And I think you know that one of the goals of this podcast is to help more people see just how connected we all are and our lives are to the refugee experience. And of course, I would consider you one of the foremost experts on refugee and immigrant economic inclusion, other issues as well, but really this idea of economic inclusion, which you started to get at in talking about your mom a little bit. When did advocating for this sort of set of issues first become important to you? Like, what was the introduction?
I mean, I think I've had lots of introductions. I've had a chance when I was young to travel to India. I saw the extreme poverty. I saw the power dynamics that exist between groups of people and how that shapes who gets access to resources or kindness. And I think that stuck with me. Also, growing up as an immigrant in 1980s Texas, which was not very friendly to people of color or to newcomers, understanding that I was always perceived as the other, regardless of the fact of speaking English fluently, speaking English with an American accent, having a nickname, which was Gina. And so no matter how hard you try to fit in, the reality is we were still perceived as the other. And so I think that dynamic of knowing what a society looks like when they see you as the other and what a society looks like when you belong, but there's so many layers of power and privilege, is what I saw in India, that some people get a fair shot and some people don't. And so I think that's motivated me not only to work with refugees, but to work with refugee women.
Yeah, refuge women. So we have sort of the picture of the experience of immigrants and of refugees and this sort of sense of belonging and when this first came on your radar screen professionally, and you've obviously had a lot of important and impactful roles before founding, I think founding Upwardly Global?
I am not a founder. I am
No,
CEO number three.
number
So,
three.
yes, but I have been around for 7 years.
Okay.
So I've earned my stripes.
Yeah, yeah. Tell us a little bit about the economic inclusion agenda. And as we sort of said earlier, thinking about your mom and all of these jobs, and thinking about the importance for me of livelihood as a real sense of sort of purpose and agency in someone's lives. What is it about the economic inclusion agenda that would be, I think, sort of both easy but also enlightening for our audience to understand?
Yeah, so I first started my career in refugee space at the Women's Refugee Commission. And at the Women's Refugee Commission, I spearheaded an effort to understand what are the trade-offs that refugee women make in order to earn an income and their safety. Because the reality is whoever you are, if you're crossing an international border to seek safety as a refugee, there's two things you care about. Are you safe? And how are you going to survive? And how you survive is part of that economic livelihoods conversation. And oftentimes in refugee response, the first instinct, which is appropriate, is how do we stabilize people so people aren't starving, people aren't dying from wounds, people have a safe shelter to live in. And that conversation around how do we also help set people up for economic success is a harder conversation that doesn't always start early. Sometimes it could start years and years later. And the reality is refugees, they need to they need to eat, they need to get clothes and medicine and all these other things, and so they are going to work. Now when we talk about refugee women, when they're doing this, they're oftentimes working in places where they don't have the right to work. They're changing their gender roles. You have women who are now primary breadwinners who may never have been a primary breadwinner or may not have been a breadwinner, but not the main one that the entire family relied on. And so that shift in their gender roles has implications of how the community they're now that's hosting them treats them, but also implications for how the men in their own communities, in their own homes treat them. Because typically there's a backlash. There's a resentment that the men can no longer withhold or uphold their traditional roles, and that they have to rely on women to do it because oftentimes women can access low wage jobs more easily. Women can navigate streets without being harassed or stopped by the police more easily. And so that just happens to be true across the board. And so for me, livelihoods is important because not only gives people dignity, but it starts the conversation of when somebody's crossing an international border, they're seeking safety and they're seeking a way to survive, and we need to acknowledge that early. So we actually met during the Afghan response. So when Kabul fell and the United States government evacuated hundreds of thousands of Afghans and hosted them on 7 US military bases, there was a huge effort by the humanitarian community to get people access to shelter and supports and programming and help them orient themselves to where they are and mental health supports. And we knew that this community was our community. At Upwardly Global, we work with immigrants and refugees who are professionals in their home countries. Many of these Afghans worked for the US government or the US military, worked as in business logistics and operations, worked in IT, and of course as translators. And so, and of course, because they were working with the US, they spoke English. So we said, we are going to go on all of these bases and we're going to set up career services. And we're going to allow people the opportunity to understand what are your skills and how do they fit into the US labor market? What jobs and titles should you be applying for? How do you shift to applying to the US market, which is very different? In most other cultures, it's more of a collectivist identity. In the United States, we're very individualistic. It's very much I, me, I, me. And so the concept of marketing yourself in a clear, concise way is new for a lot of people. And so from that, helping them understand how to navigate those US norms, and then helping people upskill or reskill if they needed to. And we knew that not everybody was going to be ready because the sheer trauma of arriving. I mean, we had people who were on buses from the airport to the base and they had no idea what country they were in. They had children who had been wearing the same diaper for the past 4 days. They were hungry. Like they were just so delirious with understanding what was going on. And so we knew not everybody was going to be ready, but we ended up serving 5,000 people within the span of 8 months from those military bases. And that gave us a real message that, this perception that refugees are a burden, refugees don't come with skills, refugees aren't able to contribute. is not the case at all. It's people want to contribute. People definitely want to contribute. I've never met a refugee who's looking for a handout.
Right.
They're looking for a handout.
100%.
They don't want to survive on a handout. They want to survive on their own 2 feet. And what we don't always do in the response is provide them that handout. And so that's why economic inclusion is so important. That's why we also feel it's important for women because it gives them options. But we also know we have to do that as part of the family because everybody's got to be bought in.
Yeah, having worked on the rights of women and girls for so long, first all the response to Afghanistan. Let me just say that I was at Malala Fund during those years, and of course, we had a sizable team working in Afghanistan on access to girls' education. And an Afghan activist who, Freshta Kareem, who I've stayed in very close contact with, she started a mobile library effort called Sharmaz, and I just remember those just such delicate months of waiting and watching for, first of all, safety, getting out of Afghanistan, but then also figuring out what the onward journey would look like for so many families. And I want to sort of put this anecdote in there, which is sort of, I know everyone has had this experience if you've traveled to a big city like Washington, D.C. or New York, and you have a taxi driver. And you find out that your taxi driver is originally from Afghanistan, and eventually he might tell you, "Oh, I was trained as this, or trained as a lawyer, trained as a doctor," and I'll tell you that many people will come home and kind of share that story casually. Can you believe it? My taxi driver, has more credentials than I have in all of these professional spaces. But I feel the work that Upwardly Global doing is sort of taking that story and actually trying to then turn it into something that we really understand how we are sitting on so much talent in this country. And so talk to us a little bit about, I mean, you already addressed it a bit, this sort of misnomer, right? That refugees aren't educated and trained and they can't contribute in these really highly skilled and technical ways, not just in the US, but in other places. Like, what's the barrier there around economic inclusion and labor pathways? Like, we could use well-trained doctors in the middle of America, in rural parts of the United States. Like, what is the block that policymakers can't get past to sort of paving the way for these individuals to contribute, like economically and otherwise, to countries like the US? I don't want to say that it's just us, because you well know that there's a lot of examples where barriers to sort of labor inclusion are frankly irrational and bad for a country's economic productivity. Like, what could we do to get through that?
I mean, the first and foremost is the right to work, which every person who works on refugee issues will tell you. And that's also in this country because people who seek asylum in the United States have to wait 6 months before they can get a work permit. And under the last Trump administration, it went up to a year. So, number one is the right to work, which includes this country. I would say number two is credential recognition. How do we understand the skills people are bringing? How do we understand the credentials if they've got it from a University of Kabul versus a University of Connecticut? Um, and that, of course, is not just for refugees, it's immigrants writ large. And part of that is why in the United States we have a movement called skills first hiring, which is how do we hire people based on the whole person? What are the skills that they bring? What are the competencies that they bring? And not what college did they go to? What was their last job? Was that job with a competitor? And so that's a shift in how we recruit and we think of talent and how we try to unpack and understand talent. So I think that's the second thing. And then I think that also includes legislation. So at Upwardly Global, we've worked with a coalition of partners to pass legislation in a number of states now, including Illinois and Virginia, and Massachusetts, which allows internationally trained doctors to work in the United States under a US licensed trained doctor for 2 years before they can then fully hit the floor on their own. But what that allows them to do is they still have to take their medical exams.
Their boards, right,
They
right.
still have to take their boards. So the quality control is still there. But what it allows them to do is instead of going through residency, which takes 3 to 4 years, they can actually start working on the hospital floor immediately. And that push really came out of COVID. We have over 200,000 internationally trained doctors in the United States, including refugees We have a lot of Ethiopian doctors who are refugees, for example, and they really wanted to serve. I mean, I was talking to a refugee Ethiopian doctor in California, and she's like, I feel like such a fraud because I took an oath. I took an oath to help and protect and use my medical skills to save lives. And I cannot do that here while I'm watching my community suffer from COVID,
Right, right.
while I'm watching hospitals overrun, while I'm watching doctors get burned out. And so I think that's also a process. And then it's, of course, the mental bias that we all have, which is, is that person really qualified? And I think we have to understand that talent is global at this stage. We are in a demographic collapse in this country. 83% of growth in our working age population today comes from immigrants and the children of immigrants.
Say the percentage again. 83%.
3%. By 2045, that will be 100%. We are having fewer children. We
Right.
have 10,000 baby boomers retiring a day. And we're an aging population. And so we need newcomers, people who want to come to the United States and rebuild, to call America home if we are going to continue to be a global competitive economic force. And so that's just the reality. So I think we're going to have to shift how we think of talent.
Yeah, I really I love that story. I'm just sort of asking, the audience to just take a minute and imagine being in a brand new place with language barriers, community barriers, trying to get your kids integrated in a school, and all the while, especially in the asylum example, 6 months to a year of waiting for this sort of, obscure process around paperwork, and you cannot work and provide for your family. And so imagine then being put on a hospital floor, partnered with a doctor, your skills that you worked hard wherever you came from, worked hard to achieve that skill, that training, that expertise, and to have that immediately employed. Like I almost get shivers just thinking about like how concretely empowering that is. Like I have a place to go, I have something to do, and I'm making a contribution to this place that I want to call home and be included in. And to do that professionally, I think so many of us just take it for granted because we've got jobs that we love and colleagues that we enjoy and a mission that we're dedicated to. Like what I mean, and so we've certainly seen so many federal workers in the Washington, D.C. area have that taken away from them from one day to the next in a way that I think really strikes at this sort of story you're telling around livelihoods and economic inclusion and what a tool it is for so much else in someone's life and existence.
I mean, I think one of the things we hear a lot from our community is when you lose your professional identity, you lose your sense of the purpose that you have in your life to be able to contribute. And that that makes most people feel like failures and a fraud. And it is debilitating. And it strips away your belief in yourself. And it's sad to see these incredible people, especially the women. They have fought tooth and nail in their own home countries to be able to get the education, to be able to get the jobs. We had a woman who was from Saudi Arabia. She was a software engineer, and she was the only female in her company in Saudi that worked there. And she became an asylum seeker because her father wanted to force her into an arranged marriage, which she refused. She has this incredible story where, after a year of being locked in her room, she said yes because he lived in the United States. She got on a plane and then she ran. She hid in a bathroom and she restarted her life in Chicago. And she was working in a bar, which, as you can imagine, a Saudi woman who has to wear all the head covering, can't show any skin, alcohol's not allowed. And now she's working in a bar. But she was not working as a software engineer. She was just hustling to get by, and she was grateful for the freedom. I think the other thing is the Fiscal Policy Institute has done research that shows that refugees, when they get employed, they have 90% retention
Yes.
year after year because they are so dedicated and committed to their employer. They're grateful.
Yes. I mean, and we have seen that. I mean, of course, companies still have to treat their employees well and sort of cultivate that relationship. But you've got this sort of willing partner from the get-go in refugee employees in a way that we too have understood to be quite unique. There's sort of a factory belt in northern Mexico where UNHCR has run some labor inclusion work. And so as families are northward bound, maybe many of them with the US in their sights, most of them are really looking at the sort of core of it. They're looking for safety, they're looking for survival, they're looking for education for their children. And so there is an effort among some states in northern Mexico to sort of capture those families, if you will, and say, what about these job opportunities? What about these communities for your home? What about your school, your healthcare? And the factory owners there, some of them Japanese tire companies, some of them American car upholstery companies, have said the exact same thing about those families, that once those workers get in, their loyalty, their retention, they stay where they are, they climb the ranks exponentially faster. They feel so dedicated and so grateful again for an opportunity of a good, safe job. It's kind of incredible. I feel like Mexico is one that really stands out for me, for a government that has said, we will be a destination and we will harness the power of that software engineer from Saudi, not at a neighborhood bar, which is wonderful employment, but maybe isn't taking full advantage of the technical skills and training that she's gone through. That's such a powerful story. And hope the audience sort of sits with a couple of these examples as you go about your life in your community, at your grocery store, or whatever it is, and think about how we make choices for the work that we do and the contribution that we make back to our communities. I'm shifting gears just a little bit. I'm not going to keep you too long today, but back to the name of the podcast. We're calling it Not Really Strangers. And I think this conversation in some ways has been exactly that, right? Like, we are not really strangers to each other, and there's so much interconnectedness that, quite frankly, we don't leverage to the degree that we should in this country, much less in sort of the communities that we live in. What does the idea of being a stranger mean to you? When you hear that word, what's your sense of it?
Yeah, it's funny. I used to work for an organization called Hias, and their subtext is "Welcome the Stranger" because it's a Jewish organization, and that's such a strong part of the Jewish faith. So for me, in that context, stranger means somebody who is new to a place and who might look and feel and act differently than I do, but at the end of the day is no less entitled to dignity and respect.
Yeah. Yeah. As you described that, I was thinking I was actually at an event just last night with Hyas, and so remember well the work that they do. It's interesting when you're growing up, you're often told, don't talk to strangers. And as I've helped my two girls navigate the world, at times I've wondered whether or not there's a reframing I can do to that. I want them always aware of their surroundings. I want them always vigilant about their own safety and sort of autonomy. But the truth is that sort of just not talking to strangers is not the point. It's really figuring out how to engage in the world in a way that keeps you safe, but also allows you the opportunity to be exposed to new people and new ideas, and to not discount them because they are not what you're accustomed to or not what you're expecting to see in a certain place. So I appreciate the twist that you did there on Stranger and taking it back to a place where you worked and contributed. We didn't talk about food at all, but I always love to end on a little bit of a breaking bread note. I'm a foodie and have grown up with such a strong food tradition and culture in my family. And it's a way of going from being strangers to feeling included at a table. So if you were hosting a dream dinner party, not so much the guests, but the food, is there any particular dish you would serve and why?
Oh, I love Indian food. Obviously, my mom made it for me. I'm not capable of cooking like my mom, so I can only get that food when she comes around. My favorite dish is prantas, which is sort of like a whole wheat flour flatbread that has a potato spiced mix in the middle. Um, and it's not great for serving at parties, but that is definitely what I would be eating.
I love it. And if it's your dream dinner party, you can have your mom come up and like
Yeah.
sort of cook and prepare for us. I mean, that's why the guest thing, I feel like that's like we have a whole planning session when we figure out who's with us at that table. So today I'm just starting with dish. Thank you for that. And thank you for this conversation. I'd love to know, is there a question I didn't ask or sort of an aspect of your professional work or kind of dedication to this cause that you would like the listeners to understand?
I think what I'd love for people to understand is that when you leave your home, it's not a choice. And there is real loss. Each one of us is desperately trying to plan our future. And in order to plan our future, we need certainty. And that goes for like, okay, my kids are going to go to middle school. Which middle school should they go? Which program is the best for them? And so we have choice and options, and we have certainty that allows us to plan. And for most refugees, that wasn't a choice. And what they enter into is even more uncertainty because they don't know what the next 3 or 5 years are going to look like. And they have to make impossible choices.
Right.
At Upwardly Global, we started operations in Warsaw, Poland, right after the war in Ukraine started. Again, because 86% of Ukrainians have a tertiary degree or higher. This was a highly educated professional group of people, and we thought they shouldn't be. And of course, 95% of them are women and children because men were not allowed to leave Ukraine because they needed to stay and support the war effort. So you have a lot of women entering into Poland with their kids. They're highly educated, and we didn't want them to be just waitresses or making pierogies and selling them on the side of the street. And so we started operations there. And the stories you hear from people about why they decided to leave, when they decided to leave, like we left because there were sirens in Kiev and everybody was being evacuated and we had been bombed for the past 3 days. What people decide to take with them is another big thing because most people don't have time to grab a lot. Some people just come with the clothes that they have on. Some people are able to grab at least a bag, then they leave. Some people make it, some people don't. And then I met a woman, Daria, who traveled for 10 days to get to Poland. I'm thinking that how far is Poland from
Right.
Kiev? But she went a circuitous route
Sure.
because she had to go through Romania. And then, of course, there's a mass exodus with hundreds of thousands or millions of other people. So you are all sleeping in your cars at the gas station, waiting for it to be refueled so that you can potentially get gas so you can keep driving. And so I think we also forget the trauma of the journey. We see people once they've arrived, but we forget that they left something, that there was trauma and a difficult journey to get where they are. And then, once they arrive, I describe it as, you know, there's so much confusion. You can't make decisions. We had women, it was like, imagine if you're jet lagged and you have to wake up early and you're half delirious and disoriented, and all you can hear is like this loud white noise of thrashing waves. And it doesn't stop. That is what it is like to live in those early days. And you cannot focus, you cannot plan, and you're glued, in this case, to your device because you've left a father, you've left a brother, you've left a husband, you've left a son, and you're not hearing from them because they're not allowed to communicate except once a week. And so you're glued to the news. And so you're paralyzed. And so I think for a lot of people, I think they forget to imagine like those are impossible choices for anybody. We often forget how privileged we are to be able to plan our futures, to have options of where we work, where we decide to send our kids, what we want to eat, and so, and then of course, months and months and months go by, and people accept the reality. And I will say, we have women, Ukrainian women in Poland. It took them 2 years before they decided to start looking for a professional job because they did not want to commit.
Yeah. Yeah. There's some part of it that feels like an acknowledgement that the situation, is sort of here to stay for at least the time being. You know that, of course, UNHCR has extensive operations in Poland, and having visited there, I think it was just last November, I was there for a bit. That sort of workforce piece, there's actually a report about the contribution that Ukrainian refugees specifically have made to the Polish GDP, and it's an extraordinary commitment.
It's 1%. They've increased the GDP by 1%.
I mean, that like integration of workforce opportunities and the education and the sort of skill set coming in, for me, it's such an example of how you can, in a moment in time, make such opportunity for individuals and also for a nation. That's a great note to end on, and so appreciate your storytelling today. I so appreciate your just sort of like weaving of so many different kind of technical points, but also sort of the soft emotional side, really, of what a journey can be, and making decisions without a sense of a certain future and how hard that is. Again, helping the audience, I hope, kind of get into the shoes of someone who's on the move and begin to better see life from their perspective, and maybe then to better understand some of the choices that are made and how we as a society, through either right to work issues or legislative choices, can frankly make it easier for those individuals and those families and make it better for all of us at the community, state, and federal level. So I really admire you. I admire the work of Upwardly Global, and I'm just grateful for the chance to connect with you today and to learn from you, as always.
No, thank you so much. I'm so glad to have had this conversation.
Thanks so much for listening. Your time is valuable, and it means a lot that you've chosen to spend it here. You can find today's show notes, including how to connect with today's guest, at unrefugees.org/notreallystrangers. That's UNREFUGEES.org/notreallystrangers. While you're there, I hope you'll consider making a donation to the organization I lead, USA for UNHCR, to help us provide more support for refugees here in the US and around the world. If this episode was impactful, please take a moment to review the show and share the episode with a friend or family member. This small action will help us have a much bigger impact. Thanks so much. Don't be a stranger.